The moon hung heavy over the village, casting long, uneasy shadows on the cracked earth. The air was thick, unmoving, as if the world itself held its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. A fire flickered in the center of the village, its glow barely reaching the wary eyes that watched from the safety of their huts. The elders sat in silence, their faces carved with fear, their ears straining for a sound they all dreaded. Then it came. A drumbeat. Faint. Distant. Calling. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering a prayer too old to be understood. A hunter gripped his spear, though he knew it was useless against what lurked beyond the trees. An old woman, her face lined with time and terror, stared toward the edge of the village, where the path disappeared into darkness. The boy stood there, young, foolish, curious. He had heard the stories, the warnings. The ones who walked the path never returned. But the night was filled with whispers, and they called to him. The air turned cold. The fire sputtered. The shadows shifted, stretching toward the boy like grasping hands. A voice, barely more than a breath, slithered through the silence. His name. A gasp. A step back. The whispers grew louder, no longer distant, no longer hidden. The trees swayed though no wind touched them. A shape loomed beyond the path, something that did not belong. The drumbeat stopped. The villagers shut their doors. The night swallowed the path. But the whispers remained. And once the path called a name, it never forgot. The fire had long died out, leaving only glowing embers beneath the heavy night air. The village lay silent, wrapped in uneasy sleep. The only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of dry leaves against the earth. He stirred. His eyes fluttered open, heart pounding for no reason he could name. Something had pulled him from sleep, something more than the stillness. He sat up, listening. A whisper. Soft. Fragile. Almost carried away by the wind. But it was there. His name. His breath hitched. He turned toward the door, expecting to see a figure, but the night beyond was empty. The whisper came again, closer, curling through the cracks in the walls. He reached for his spear, his fingers slick with sweat. The air in the hut felt wrong. Too thick, too still. He stepped outside. The village was motionless, as if the world had been frozen in time. Even the crickets had stopped singing. A third time, the whisper came. His name, stretching, twisting, spoken by something that did not belong. He turned toward the path. The trees stood like silent watchers, their branches moving though no wind blew. Shadows pooled where they should not, stretching toward him like fingers reaching from the earth. A single footprint lay in the dust at the village boundary. Not his. Not anyone's. Fresh, yet untouched by the moonlight. The whisper wrapped around him, seeping into his bones. It no longer came from the trees. It was beside him. Warm breath brushed against his ear. The voice was no longer a whisper. You are awake. The night was restless. The air hung thick with unease, pressing against the village like unseen hands. Fires burned low, their light flickering against the mud walls of silent huts. The elders sat wide-eyed in their homes, listening, waiting. Then it came. A single beat. Low. Hollow. It echoed through the village like a heartbeat from the earth itself. The sound vibrated through the ground, rattling clay pots and sending a shiver through those who heard it. No one had touched the sacred drum in 100 years. No hands had dared to strike its cursed hide. Yet, in the darkness, it played. Another beat followed, then another. Slow. Measured. Calling. The villagers stirred, faces pale in the dim torchlight. Mothers held their children close, whispering prayers the gods had long stopped answering. The hunters gripped their weapons, though there was nothing to fight. At the edge of the village, the drum sat untouched in the abandoned shrine. The leather skin was cracked with age, the wood splintered from time. Yet it moved, the mallets rising and falling in the hands of something unseen. A final beat rang out, deep and resounding. The air trembled. The trees groaned. The earth sighed as if something beneath had awoken. The silence that followed was heavier than before. A presence now loomed in the darkness beyond the path, unseen but felt. Then, the whisper returned. Stronger. Closer. We have waited long enough. The village of Odu had fallen silent under the weight of an unnatural hush. The trees no longer swayed with the wind, and even the crickets dared not sing. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the sky itself was pressing down. Then he arrived. A lone figure walked through the mist, his frame draped in tattered robes that seemed to drink in the darkness. His feet barely disturbed the dust on the road, yet his shadow stretched impossibly long, reaching toward places untouched by light. Obi, the blacksmith's son, was the first to see him. The boy had been gathering firewood near the village square when he noticed the stranger's arrival. Something about him was wrong. His gait was too smooth, his movements too measured, as though he glided rather than walked. The villagers emerged slowly, their curiosity fighting their fear. The stranger stopped at the well, dipping his hand into the water. He did not drink. He merely watched the ripples, as if searching for something beneath the surface. Then he turned. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. But it was his eyes, deep, empty sockets where no light could touch, that sent a shudder through those who met his gaze. "Who are you?" Chief Dyke finally asked, his voice firm but wary. The stranger smiled, but it was a hollow thing, like a mask forced into place. "I am a traveler, seeking the forgotten path." A murmur spread through the crowd. None spoke of the path. None dared. Obi took a step back, his breath hitching. The stranger's shadow twitched, moving against the windless night. The silence stretched. And then, the stranger whispered, "It remembers you, too." The night carried a strange stillness, the kind that made even the bravest souls hesitate before stepping outside. But curiosity is a cruel master. The villagers, drawn by whispers they could not name, gathered near the old well where the stranger had stood hours before. Obi clutched his father's arm, his gaze fixed on the forest's edge. Something shimmered there, just beyond the gnarled trees, something that had not been there before. Chief Dyke raised a flaming torch, the flickering light revealing an eerie truth. A path, narrow, winding, unnatural, stretched beyond the village and into the forbidden woods. No one had seen it before, not even the oldest among them. "The path? It wasn't here," Mama Aoife muttered, her voice shaking. "Not in the daylight," the stranger murmured, stepping forward. "But when the moon watches, it remembers." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard the stories. The forbidden forest was a place of lost souls, of echoes that did not belong to the living. None who wandered its depths ever returned. Yet, the path gleamed under the moon's glow, beckoning. It pulsed as if alive. Obi's heartbeat thundered in his chest. He could see footprints forming on the dirt, soft indentations, one after another, though no one had taken a step. "It's calling to us," Neka, the healer, whispered. Chief Dyke tightened his grip on his spear. "And things that call from the dark are rarely friends." The stranger's hollow eyes gleamed. "Then why do your names already linger on the path?" The villagers froze. A gust of wind rushed past, carrying with it a single truth, whispered in a voice not of this world. They had been expected. The fire burned low in the village square, casting long shadows on the gathering crowd. The air smelled of damp earth and unease. No one spoke, their eyes fixed on the hunched figure seated near the dying embers. Mama Ejul, the oldest woman in Odu, was feared for reasons no one dared to name. Some whispered she had outlived her own death, that she had spoken to things that did not belong in the world of men. Now, she spoke again. "You have seen the path," she rasped, her voice like dry leaves scraping stone. "You have heard its whispers. But did you listen?" The villagers shuddered. None answered. She lifted her trembling hands, her fingers curling as if grasping unseen threads. "3 warnings," she muttered. "3 omens before the devourer wakes." A cold wind slithered through the crowd. "The first," she exhaled, her breath curling like mist in the night air. "A night where the moon bleeds, and the sky weeps tears of ash." A murmur rippled through the villagers. Only 2 nights before, the moon had hung low, red as an open wound. "The second," Mama Ejul continued, "is the voice of the dead in the mouths of the living." Chief Dyke stiffened. He thought of the stranger, his hollow eyes, his words that felt older than time. "And the third," someone whispered. Mama Ejul's gaze lifted, her clouded eyes fixed on the darkened path beyond the trees. "The third is when the path no longer waits to be found." She leaned forward, her breath cold against Obi's ear. "But finds you instead." A sharp crack echoed through the air. The villagers turned. The path was no longer in the forest. It was in the village. The air was thick with mist as the villagers followed the winding path, their footsteps swallowed by the silence. The trees leaned inward, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers. Somewhere ahead, water lapped against unseen banks. Then they saw it. A river, dark as the abyss, stretched before them. Its surface was smooth, undisturbed, except for the lanterns. Hundreds of them. They floated in eerie formation, their golden glow flickering against the black water. No hands had placed them there. No wind carried them. Yet they drifted, slow and deliberate, like prisoners pacing their cells. Obi swallowed hard. The lanterns weren't empty. Faces stared back at him. Faint, distorted images flickered within the flames. Mouths frozen in silent screams, eyes wide with despair. Some faces shifted, twisting in agony before vanishing into smoke, only to reappear in another lantern. Neka clutched her shawl. What is this place? The river of the forgotten, the stranger murmured. He stood at the edge of the water, his hollow eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. Each light, a soul lost to the path. Chief Dyke stepped forward, gripping his spear. Then we turned back. The stranger smiled, thin, knowing. You can't. A gust of wind howled through the trees. The lanterns flickered wildly, and the water stirred. A new light bobbed to the surface, dim at first, then brighter. Obi's breath hitched. The face inside was familiar. His own. A choked cry left his throat. The villagers turned, their gasps sharp as knives. More lanterns rose from the depths, each holding the face of someone still standing on the shore. The river had already claimed them. Ikeen, the village hunter, had always trusted the forest. It spoke in whispers of rustling leaves, in the heartbeat of the earth beneath his feet. But now, the forest was silent, and the silence was a lie. He found the mask half buried beneath the roots of an ancient Irako tree, its surface carved from something darker than wood, smoother than stone. The eye sockets were deep, hollow, as if they had swallowed the faces of those who had worn it before. A whisper curled around his ear, though no one stood near. Wear it. Ikeen's fingers trembled as he lifted the mask. The moment it touched his skin, the world shifted. He was no longer in the forest. A village stood before him, identical to Odu, yet wrong. The air smelled of rot, the huts crumbling like old bones. Figures moved in the distance, twisted, broken shapes dragging themselves through the dirt. Their faces were blurred, featureless, except for their mouths. Their mouths never closed. Screams, endless, layered, voices of men, women, children, poured from their lips, yet their hollow eyes remained fixed ahead, empty. A shadow loomed over them, taller than the trees, its arms stretched unnaturally long, its fingers scraping the ground. It had no face, only a mask, the same one Ikeen now wore. Then it turned. It saw him. Ikeen gasped, his body snapping back into the present. He tore the mask from his face, his chest heaving. He was still in the forest. The Irako tree still stood, but the earth beneath him was disturbed, as if something had crawled out. And in his hand, the mask was no longer cold. It was warm. It was breathing. The night was thick with silence, pressing against the thatched roofs like a held breath. The villagers sat huddled in their homes, listening to the absence of crickets, the absence of wind. Then the drums began. A single, hollow beat echoed from the trees, slow and deliberate. Then another, and another. Obi peered through a crack in the wooden shutters. His stomach clenched. They were here. Figures stood at the village's edge, lined in rows like forgotten statues. Dozens. No, hundreds. Their bodies were wrapped in tattered cloth, their heads tilted unnaturally to one side. But it was their faces, or the lack of them, that made Bao rise in his throat. Smooth skin stretched where eyes should have been. No mouths. No noses. Just emptiness. They did not move. They did not breathe. Yet, somehow, they were waiting. Mama Ifea whimpered from the corner of the hut, clutching her grandson to her chest. What do they want? She whispered. The question lingered, unanswered. Then, as one, the figures lifted their heads. Though eyeless, they all turned in the same direction. Obi followed their gaze, to the center of the village. To the old well. The earth trembled beneath their feet. The wood of the shutters groaned as unseen hands pressed against them. Somewhere in the distance, a child began to cry. The stranger with hollow eyes stepped forward from the shadows, his voice calm. almost gentle. They have come to take back what was stolen. Chief Dyke clenched his spear. And if we refuse? The stranger smiled. The drums stopped. The figures took a step forward. The ground trembled as the faceless figures advanced, their silent steps pressing against the earth like a slow-moving tide. The villagers clung to one another, whispering desperate prayers. Then Mama Edgell's voice cut through the darkness. It was never the path that was forgotten. All eyes turned to the old woman as she stepped forward, her frail hands shaking. It was the price. Chief Dyke's grip on his spear tightened. What do you mean? She did not answer him. Instead, she turned to the stranger, her clouded eyes searching his hollow ones. You were the first. The villagers stiffened. A cold wind wrapped around them, carrying whispers that were not their own. The stranger did not blink. I was. Mama Edgell's voice wavered. Long ago, the firstborn of this village were offered to the path, to keep the Nameless from claiming us all. It was a pact, a curse bound in silence. A murmur rippled through the villagers. Neka clutched her chest. That's not true. My father was firstborn, and he. She stopped. Memories unraveled in her mind like a frayed thread. Had her father ever spoken of his siblings? Had her grandfather? Had any firstborn lived to tell their tale? The truth settled like a weight on their chests. Mama Edgell turned back to the stranger. You were the first to be taken, but you found your way back. The stranger's lips curled in something that was not quite a smile. No one truly leaves the path. A cry rang out. Obi staggered forward, clutching his head. His veins darkened beneath his skin, spreading like roots. The faceless figures did not stop. The Nameless had come to collect their due. The first sound was a whisper, low, almost gentle, like the rustling of dry leaves. Then came the first drumbeat. Deep, hollow, final. Obi gasped, his body convulsing as unseen hands gripped him. The veins beneath his skin pulsed, dark as ink. The faceless figures stood motionless, but the air around them shimmered, bending like heat over fire. Another drumbeat. Then another. The villagers clutched their ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside them, inside their bones, their blood, their names. Mama Edgell staggered forward, her breath coming in short gasps. It has begun. Chief Dyke raised his spear. What has begun? The stranger with hollow eyes did not answer. He only watched as the air split open. The village groaned, huts trembling as cracks formed along the ground. From the old well, a thick mist slithered upward, twisting and writhing like living tendrils. And then they came. The spirits. They rose from the mist, their forms shifting, flickering between shapes, some familiar, some monstrous. They had no voices, only the sound of the drums and the rhythmic, unnatural movements of their bodies. One stepped forward. A woman. Her face was half-rotted, her lips torn and stretched. Mama Aoife screamed. That's my mother. Another. A child with empty sockets where I should have been. More came. The forgotten. The firstborn. The ones the village had sacrificed, now returned. The drums thundered, louder, faster, their rhythm pulling the spirits forward. The faceless figures raised their hands in unison. Obi gasped, his eyes rolling back as his feet left the ground. His body jerked unnaturally, limbs twisting. The stranger stepped closer, his hollow gaze fixed on the sky. The Nameless have come home. Then the final drumbeat struck, and the village of Odu screamed. The night pulsed with the rhythm of the drums, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes. The spirits circled the village, their twisted forms flickering in and out of the mist. The Nameless loomed, their faceless heads tilted in eerie silence. Obi hung in the air, his body writhing as whispers crawled beneath his skin. The villagers sobbed, trapped between terror and guilt. Then Mama Edgell's voice rang out, hoarse but firm. The curse was never in the sacrifice. The drums faltered. The spirits turned. Even the Nameless hesitated. The old woman took a shaky step forward. We were told the firstborn must be given to the path, that the Nameless demanded a life to keep the village safe. Her breath shuddered. But that was a lie. Chief Dyke's grip on his spear tightened. What are you saying? She pointed to the well, where the mist churned violently. There was supposed to be a sacrifice, but it was never made. The villagers stiffened. Mama Edgell's eyes burned with something ancient. Long ago, our ancestors made a promise. They would offer one life to seal the path forever. But when the time came, her voice trembled. The elders chose to deceive. A sharp wind tore through the village. The spirits shuddered, their flickering forms rippling like disturbed water. They gave nothing, Mama Edgel continued. And so, the Nameless waited. Her gaze swept over the villagers. We were never spared. We were living on borrowed time. A guttural sound rose from the Nameless. A low, unearthly growl. Obi gasped, his body jerking violently. The air grew thick with shadows. The sacrifice had never been made. And now, the Nameless had come to collect. The air thickened with an unnatural weight as Odysseus stepped forward, gripping the blade he had reforged with the elders' whispers. The village square, once alive with whispers of lost souls, stood silent, the mist curling around him like unseen fingers. A low, guttural growl echoed from the void ahead. From the darkness, the keeper emerged, a twisted specter of bone and rotting sinew, its hollow eyes brimming with an abyss deeper than the night. You should not have come, it rasped, its voice layered with echoes of the damned. Odysseus tightened his stance, heart pounding. You've imprisoned them long enough, he declared. Tonight, this ends. The keeper lunged, shadows writhing like living serpents. Odysseus barely dodged, rolling to the side as the ground cracked beneath the entity's touch. He struck with his blade, but the steel passed through vapor, the wound sealing instantly. Laughter, cold and soulless, filled the air. Foolish hunter, the keeper hissed. This place belongs to me. The village is my cage, and I, its master. Odysseus' mind raced. The elder's words surfaced, light against shadow, truth against deception. His grip tightened. With a deep breath, he drew the amulet from his neck, its carved symbols pulsating with a golden glow. The keeper recoiled. No. It hissed, the mist around it twisting in agony. Odysseus chanted the forbidden words. Light erupted from the amulet, piercing through the entity. The keeper shrieked, shadows peeling away as the souls it had imprisoned broke free, their wails merging into a deafening crescendo. The ground trembled. The mist dispersed. The village stirred. Odysseus fell to his knees, breath ragged. The keeper was gone, its hold shattered. But as the wind carried a whisper, for now, he knew the path was never truly forgotten. Aho stood at the heart of the village, his breath shallow, his body trembling. The keeper was gone, but something lingered, a force unseen, a name unspoken. The ground beneath him pulsed, veins of blackness crawling from the cracked earth. Then a whisper, faint, ancient. Say it. Aho clenched his fists, his mind battling the urge. He knew the stories, the name that could unmake reality, the curse that bound the forgotten path. The village had survived on silence, on never uttering what should remain buried. The air grew thick with voices, wailing, pleading, demanding. Shadows flickered through the mist, forming twisted, half-remembered figures. The lost souls. They hovered, their mouths moving soundlessly, but Aho knew what they wanted. Speak it, and we are free. His heart pounded. If he spoke, the village might be saved, but at what cost? What would be unleashed? The amulet in his grip burned hot, its glow faltering. Then laughter. Soft at first, then rising. A presence loomed behind him. Not the keeper. Something older. Something worse. Speak it, the souls wailed. Aho's lips parted. A force beyond his control pushed against his mind, a syllable forming on his tongue. But at the last moment, he slammed his mouth shut. He gritted his teeth, gripping the amulet tighter. No, he whispered. The world convulsed. The figures shrieked, their forms unraveling, swallowed into the mist. The earth trembled, rejecting the ancient force that sought release. Then, silence. The darkness faded, the cursed path sealing itself once more. Aho collapsed, gasping. The village was still, empty, silent. He was alone. And yet, from the void, a whisper slithered through the air, soft, patient, waiting. Next time, Aho, you will speak it.